Welcome, gentlemen. We are continuing what we did a couple of days ago with the overview of the specs to play in Season 4. We started with the range DPS, so now it's time to go over the melee DPS. The second most popular role after the range DPS in this game is the melee ones. Of course, tanks and healers are lower down, also because there is much less of them. So what we have to go over is thinking about what could be a good idea to be played in Season 4, what could be meta in Season 4, what is going to happen if you take the meta right now and then you nerf Survival Hunter, what's gonna change, what's gonna shape, for example, the Mythic Plus meta, etc, etc. Were you planning on playing a certain spec already? What do you value? What do you even value in playing certain specs? Do you just want a spec that is fun? Do you just want the spec that is meta? You don't actually care about how fun it is, you just want for once to be invited in Mythic Plus keys without having to be declined simply due to the spec you're playing. So you are set, you are hard set on playing a very meta spec, etc, etc. There might be a plethora of reasons as to why you would want to play a certain spec for whatever reason, so let's try to go and explore them in today's video about melee DPS. So first, before we do anything else, we have to start with describing how the meta is currently. As we get into Season 4, how is the situation so far? The situation at the moment sees at the top, on its own, in its own island, Survival Hunter. They are clearly the largest outlier out of all the melee DPS when it comes to Mythic Plus. In Raid Encounters, they are not nearly as dominant, but they are still, for example, at the moment, being the best performing melee DPS spec in the raid, together with Frost Death Knight and Outlaw Rogue. So yes, that is true. If you take a strictly single target boss, for example, like Skolex, Survival is in the bottom 6, for example. If you take another fight that is pretty much entirely single target, like Alondrus, you will once again find Survival at the bottom. Even if you take the fight of the tier, which is the Jailer in Mythic, Survival is the absolute worst performing out of all DPS specs. So while their dominance is complete, it's total and complete in Mythic Plus, they are not as S tier in the raid, but because they are so much better than anyone else in Mythic Plus, they retain their S tier spot overall. Right below them, you see Outlaw and you see Havoc, Demon Hunter. This is weird because we haven't really seen Outlaw that much this tier. People might even be lost as to why is Outlaw rated this high. That's because Outlaw has gotten buffed by quite a bit over time. Now they are doing much better. Now they are currently the third better performing melee DPS spec in the raid, and they have kept rising in popularity in Mythic Plus. When we started reporting on their rising popularity in Mythic Plus, they didn't even show up. They didn't even show up in keys higher than plus 25. Then they went to 0.9, to 1.7, to 3.6, and now they are currently at 7.1%, and they have continuously kept rising in popularity. So I'm getting ahead of myself here, ahead of the curve of the meta, and say that Outlaw is doing quite well right now, together with Havoc. That's because Havoc is not the best in Mythic Plus, it's not even in the top 3, and it's not the best in the raid. It's not even in the top 3. The reason why they make top 3 here is simply because all the other specs have much more of a different gap between how good they are in Mythic Plus compared to how good they are in the raid. Havoc is much more balanced overall. And talking about the gap they have, depending on the activity, you have the third tier at the moment in Season 3, which is Windwalker, Fury, Frost, and Subtlety. These 4 specs right now are very polarizing. Windwalker is better than Havoc, for example, in Mythic Plus, but they are much worse in the raid. Another good example is Frost Death Knight, which is doing better in the raid, but worse in Mythic Plus. You have Subtlety, which has lost significantly in the raid recently. We have covered this in our last raid recap, where they kept dropping and dropping in performance. You have Fury as well, which is doing much better in Mythic Plus than they are in the raid. They are currently one of the worst performers in the raid. So unlike Havoc, these specs right below them are much more up or down depending on the activity. And then you have the bottom. You have the bottom 6. In the C tier you have Feral, Red Paladin and Enhancement, and in the D tier you have Arms, Assassination and Unholy. They are worse, you know, they are performing worse in both activities. They don't have too much of a ways out. At the moment, sure, Arms has gotten buffed and is doing slightly better. Enhancement still has the bonus of doing very good single target damage in the raid and having Wind Fury, so perhaps in the raid their value is a little bit higher than, for example, Feral or Ret, but overall it's not as exciting. So this would be the situation as you go thinking about playing a melee spec in Season 4. So if you go one by one, you could start thinking, okay, if I play Survival, how many odds there are that it's going to remain an S tier spec? Or if I happen to like how, for example, Unholy plays, but it is currently into the bottom tier, how likely is it that it's going to be doing much better, or perhaps that it's going to be buffed in Season 4? So the first thing worth pointing out is that we have to rebalance this, we have to think about something new because Survival is getting nerfed. We don't know if there is going to be any more balance tuning, we don't know if there's going to be any more nerfs to other specs, for example, Windwalker's AoE, just to name one, or if there's not going to be any at all, but what we do know is that Destro and Survival are going to be nerfed in their AoE power. It is very likely that once you take down Survival's AoE power, you have two options. Either the AoE power was so big to begin with that the nerf is not going to do anything and Survival will continue to be as strong or stronger than all the others, or it's going to be enough, in which case it's likely that other specs that were still popular for their AoE will simply take the spot of Survival. This is why at the moment there are quite high stocks being put on Windwalker, because at the moment Windwalker is the next best thing when it comes to AoE damage in Mythic Plus, when it comes to melee DPS, right after Survival. So their stocks when it comes to Mythic Plus viability are quite high. They are already the second best spec, the second most brought spec in Mythic Plus for melee after Survival. So they are clearly the next best choice for Season 4, in case the nerf for Survival is going to be big enough. That's one of the first clear things we can say about Season 4 meta for melee DPS. However, we always have to consider that sometimes some players don't just play every spec because it's meta, right? Yes, sure, Survival became the best pick for melee and Destro became the best pick for ranged, but it's not that the player base is completely and entirely dominated by Destro and Survival. There are still plenty of other players in other specs. So maybe what you're interested in is a spec that fits your playstyle, more so than fitting the meta, right? Maybe you just wanted a slow spec, you wanted a fast spec, you wanted a spec with a rotation, a very fixed rotation, you know, 1 to 3, 1 to 3, back to 1, 1 to 3, 1 to 3, or maybe you wanted a more proc-based spec. You wanted various different things about your playstyle that didn't have too much to do with how powerful they were. So when it comes to playstyle, when it comes to diversity, you know, when it comes to variety, to how many different things you can do, obviously you always have the chances. We talked about this before, about the boring answer to this question. The boring answer to this question is play Rogue, because Rogue has 3 different specs. So it is simply much easier, it's much more likely statistically to find the correct playstyle for your own tastes, because you have 3 different specs to rotate to. You could go the very fast button pressing, very simple 1, 2, 3 rotation of Outlaw, or you could go to a much slower paced, much more pooling, intensive and spectator mode rotation of Assassination, or you could go in the middle. You could go in the middle and play Subtlety, which is very slow when it's not in Shadowlands, and then it becomes very fast inside of Shadowlands, and then back to being very slow. So it's much simpler, it's much more likely for you to find a nice balance of what you enjoy in a class that has 3 specs to choose from, as opposed to, for example, if you just go and play Retribution. You know, either you like Retribution or you don't, and you have to reroll to a different class because you don't have any other option, unless you consider the fact that Prot Paladin out DPSs Red Paladin in Mythic Plus, so you might as well consider it a secondary DPS spec, but that's another point we're not going to be making here. When it comes to diversity, as I said, Rogue is much more likely to give you what you need in terms of different styles. Then you have Warrior and you have Death Knight. Those, simply from the power of having 2 different specs, can give you more likely an answer to what you're looking for, as opposed to survival, feral, windwalker, red paladin, and havoc demon hunter, which are basically either you play that or you have to reroll to something else. So it's much more risky for you to go for a hybrid spec without a way to go back to, without a way to fall back to a different spec in the same class. So for the way I see it, when it comes to diversity, when it comes to doing things, for example, when it comes to changing talents, changing soulbinds, changing legendaries, which can cause you to change rotations, change abilities in your rotation, change the timings of your cooldowns, and all this type of diversity, this is how I would go as a melee DPS. I think enhancement is very fun to play. It does have two different builds centered around, most of the times, either Mythic Plus and AoE and walls damage or single target damage. You have subtlety, which I think has one of the better and more engaging types of rotation. It's going to be very fitting for all the people craving some dopamine hits to play subtlety. You are slow, you start ramping up your excitement to get into Shadow Dance, and then you get excited and satisfied that you pulled off a proper Shadow Dance window, and then you go back into the down phase waiting for the next Shadow Dance. It's a pretty good loop of a rotation. Right below them you have Windwalker and Fury. They have a similar style. Windwalker has this loop of Storm, Earth and Fire, and the whole bunch of abilities you have to use for your Whirling Dragon Punch. It always feels very good to play that type of rotation, and currently, we said this already, they are on a pretty good spot for being good in Season 4 if we assume the nerfs to survival. And Fury, which is always it is always the pick of choice for melee DPS if you want to play a very fast, very engaging and very satisfying, with a good ending dopamine hit to your rotation loop of Rampage. That's a very good loop for a rotation for a DPS. In the middle you have Ret, you have Unholy, and you have Havoc. Ret has a pretty serviceable, a pretty decent rotation. It does have a pretty large cooldown window they can use, but it's not as big as the days of old. It has lost quite a bit in Shadowlands compared to BFA. Unholy is kind of the same. Unholy has been nerfed over time. Nobody knows quite how, because it wasn't even that oppressive at the start of Shadowlands, but now it is still a very simple spec. It's not that fast until you get into your Frenzied Monstrosity, into your cooldowns, and you get to put out your army, additional army ghouls, etc, etc, and then you get back into a more passive rotation. Same for Havoc. Havoc is quite simple in terms of rotation. It doesn't have too many options. It used to have different options. They have been nerfed by Blizzard, so now they don't have that many options at their disposal. To the bottom you have specs that start lacking a little bit more in options of their rotation. Survival is very simple despite the damage they are doing. Feral, of course, is also quite boring. It has been neutered since their more complex days of a couple of expansions ago, even Warlords times. And then you have Frost Death Knight. Frost Death Knight does have a pretty good loop, but many people at this point have started to get Breath of Sindragosa fatigue. They're starting to get quite annoyed, so I'm not gonna be the one to force you into this playstyle. And at the bottom you have the worst ones, I believe. You have Outlaw, you have Arms, and you have Assassination. Outlaw, I just think, is the worst version of Fury. It has a very fast playstyle, very quick, one of the fastest button pressing DPS specs in the game. However, I just don't think it's as exciting as Fury. Fury's Rampage. Outlaws is just constantly building combo points with Pistol Shot and Sinister Strike, and then finishing it with Dispatch over and over and over and over. It's not really a proper loop. It's more like a straight line that goes on the same all the time, so it's not nearly as exciting. Arms is the classic boomer grog type of build. Very simple, very straightforward. Some people enjoy it because of the sound of Mortal Strike, because it's quite satisfying, but overall it's a quite simple spec. And then Assassination. Assassination has been dumbed down far too many times from their older days of Legion, even Warlords. Now it's much more simple, and as a result, if a spec that was so slow, so technical in how much you want to wait and plan for your bleeds and dots and pooling of energy, if you take away the complexity, if you take away the strategy around this meticulous build, then it's just slow. It is just slow and boring without too much excitement around it, so I don't think it's very fun and engaging to play. This will be my setup for the enjoyment and the variety that these specs have when playing the game, completely excluding where they currently are in the meta. This would be where they currently are in the meta, which has nothing to do with how engaging or fun they are. So when talking about the melee DPS, just like when we talked about the range DPS, at the end, the only thing that matters at the moment is if we are going to be getting any more balance tuning, because obviously all of this talk might be completely useless and just some theory crafting, some feely crafting, because maybe Blizzard decides to make Red Paladin OP in Season 4. So at this point, everything we just talked about goes down the drain, and we have to reshape the entire meta around Red being first. So at the moment, we can just extrapolate that if Survival gets nerfed heavily, then Windwalker is prime to take their spot as the next big AoE spec in Mythic Plus. That's the only thing we know so far. The rest is mostly just trying to think about what you might play. You know, it's gonna be up to chance. If you are interested in playing something that is meta, then you will have to wait. You know, if you're interested, if you're saying, man, I really enjoy enhancement, is it going to be meta in Season 4? If we don't know about balance tuning yet, then the answer is going to be no. If we simply take the enhancement of today, we give him 20 more item levels and 2 or 3 best in slot items of his choice from the tokens, that's not going to be enough to become meta in Season 4. Even if Survival gets nerfed, it's not going to be enough for enhancement to become meta. So in that regard, if your main interest is meta, if your main interest is being chosen and being picked, then the balance tuning is what you will have to wait. If you don't care about that, if your main interest is playing an interesting class, a fun spec, a diverse class and a diverse spec, then you can already start making your way towards a spec or class to play. I can say, I don't want to ruin your entire season by saying this, but I'm pretty confident if you were already thinking, if you were already planning on choosing a rogue for Season 4, then you are pretty safe in continuing to do so even before you have seen any balance tuning. It is very, very likely that in any case, in whatever Blizzard does with balance tuning, we will still have a good, proper meta rogue spec available. So that's not going to be too much of a risk. Same goes if you're planning to play Warrior or if you're planning to play Death Knight, it's likely it's still going to be somewhat safe. I would put, given what we have now, Warrior above Death Knight. And then the rest is mostly going to be a coin flip at the moment. Without any further news about the balancing, it's going to be up to your belief. How much are you confident in Enhancement Shaman or Havoc or Red Paladin to be meta because they get buffed in Season 4? You know, at the moment we don't have too much to go off on, so we will have to wait to see if Blizzard plans to do something else before the release of Season 4. I'm hopeful they will. I'm hopeful we will get more than just a couple of nerfs to Destro and Survival. I'm pretty sure there will be something else. So I would also be pretty confident in seeing some changes in the melee DPS. For the moment, this is what we have as far as melee DPS are concerned. Somehow, some way, the video got even longer than the range DPS. I'm going to excuse this by saying that the melee DPS have 2 more specs, so it's expected to make the video somewhat longer, but with this being said, it's time to leave. Thank you guys, of course, for watching the video and for helping to grow and support the channel in any way you can, which includes liking and commenting on this video as well as subscribing to the channel. This one being a melee DPS themed video. Everyone who is planning already, who is trying to choose a new spec for Season 4 and was thinking about a melee DPS, is encouraged to subscribe. I am also, as further notice, I am available on Twitter to be followed but not creepily stalked, as well as if you're able, preferably with your mom's credit card, you can subscribe to my Patreon as well. That will also give you access to come join my Discord channel if you want to ask some questions about the content, some tips, some infos. If you wanted to chat about something about the content that you see released, you can join in and ask me. I am usually always available. So with all of this social junk being said, thank you guys for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, oh my god, my throat. It was a rough one. I did a back-to-back video recording of like an hour straight, so it took a toll.